Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 32 of the regular season for the San Jose Sharks as they took on the Toronto Maple Leafs and won by a score of 3-2 in overtime. And the extreme inconsistencies of the San Jose Sharks do continue here tonight. You go back 6 days ago to the game against the Dallas Stars. The Sharks had very little doing offensively in a very boring game loss to the Dallas Stars. 2 days later, they put up one of their more impressive victories of the entire season over a strong Carolina Hurricanes team. 2 days after that, they look completely lifeless in a matchup against the Philadelphia Flyers, and then tonight they are able to put up a very solid effort against a not that great Leafs team who find themselves currently outside of the playoff picture, but who have been surging at least a little bit as of late, and the Sharks are able to stop them in their tracks. And not only did the Sharks play well tonight, but it was one of the very rare times this season where they've actually managed to outshoot their opponents. This wouldn't be much of an accomplishment or anything worth mentioning for most other teams in the NHL, but for a Sharks squad who has rarely managed to pull off this feat, this is something to bring up. The final shots, I believe, were 32-30. Getting that edge, however slight it may have been, is not something we have seen a lot of this season. Now, when it comes to this first period, it was actually rather back and forth, good chances both ways, pretty entertaining first 20 minutes here, but it was the Leafs with the only goal. That one comes from Dakota Joshua to give them that 1-0 lead heading into the second period, where the Leafs would expand on their lead with a Austin Matthews power play goal. That makes it 2-0, and so it was unfortunate because up to that point, the Sharks had really not played all that poorly in this game, but found themselves getting shut out 2-0. However, Dmitry Orlov with an extremely important goal, his first of the season, gives the Sharks some life heading into that third period. He pulled this one off just a few minutes left in the second off of a very, very nice shot. And so in that third period, the Sharks are the team getting the majority of the shots and the majority of the chances. Nothing extremely dangerous, but a couple of relatively close calls. And then it would appear that the Sharks would tie the game off of a Barclay Goodrow goal. He sends this puck in front looking for Ryan Reeves, but it deflects off of a Maple Leaf defenseman's skate and gets past their goaltender. That tied it up at 2 until the Leafs decide to challenge it for the offside, and indeed the goal comes off the board. Now, I saw some confusion about this situation, people thinking that this was the incorrect call, but it actually was correct. What ends up happening here is that Gaudette has this puck as he is inside of the offensive zone. The puck is still in the neutral zone. Now, this is perfectly fine because in the rule book, you are allowed to enter the offensive zone before the puck if you have full possession of it. However, the mistake from Gaudette here is that he looks to make this pass to Barclay Goodrow before he actually brings the puck into the offensive zone. And so the moment that he actually goes for this pass, he now no longer has possession of it, and then he is in the zone before the puck is. That immediately does put him offside. Now, the linesman missed it in real time, but this was not a very long review whatsoever because they saw that, yes, once Gaudette made that pass, he immediately put himself offside. So this was the correct call, and the Sharks remained down 1 goal. But while it took a little bit of extra time there, and it took to the Sharks actually pulling their goaltender, they do find that equalizer. This one comes from John Klingberg in the 6-on-5, and that ties the game up at 2. In the overtime, the Sharks actually decide to stray away from what they have usually gone in the overtime period this season. We haven't seen the extra time here for the Sharks in a game for a good amount of time, and so it is Wenberg who actually ends up being joined by Celebrini. Previously, it would have been a Wenberg-Eklund setup up front with whichever defenseman was having the best night, and indeed it was Klingberg who ends up getting the honors there on that first shift. However, it didn't really matter all that much. The Leafs got possession, and for the first full minute of this overtime, nothing actually happened. The Leafs just entered and exited the zone about 3 times, again reminding us all why the NHL should be making a rule change to prevent this from happening, because I almost fell asleep in that first minute. However, once the Sharks got back possession, they know how to have fun in the 3-on-3. We got some more back and forth, and eventually it is Alex Wenberg who scores to give the Sharks that OT game winner, the 2 points, to help themselves put this road trip now, that 5-game road trip, to a 2-2 record, heading into an all-deciding 5th game there against the Penguins in a couple of nights. When it comes to the players to talk about, we have the Sharks top line, at least to begin this game, of Celebrini, Smith, and Colin Graf. And usually in a San Jose Sharks victory, I don't like to be super negative. You know, you want to keep the positive vibes going in a win because the Sharks, especially over these last couple of seasons, have not had a lot of wins. But I do have to comment on this situation that Warsofsky created in this game for whatever reason. So this top trio started together and was actually playing rather well. Like, they must have had 3 very good chances just in the first period alone, and even managed to create an opportunity for themselves at the beginning of the second period as well. And yet, for whatever reason, at about the halfway mark of this game, Warsofsky decides to drop Graf to the second line, drop Eklund to the third line, and to promote Kurashev up to that top group with Celebrini and Smith. And I cannot possibly comprehend the logic behind this decision for a multitude of reasons. The first of which is that Graf was working very well with this top trio. Like him, Celebrini, and Smith, this is the best that the Sharks' first line has actually looked all season long. They were the best line of the night against the Carolina Hurricanes a few days ago. They had some issues in the game against the Philadelphia Flyers, but they were one of the only lines, if not the only line, actually getting some offensive chances. And here tonight, as I said, they started off rather well. They were given a matchup against Austin Matthews, who many people have underrated these days due to the fact that his scoring has taken a significant step back from the 70-goal scorer he was a couple of years ago, but he is still one of the best defensive forwards in the entire NHL. This was a real challenge for Celebrini, and yet, despite the maybe zone time being relatively equal across these top lines, it was the Celebrini line that was actually able to generate high danger opportunities. Matthews himself had a couple of pretty good looks, but Domi, outside of being some decent energy, didn't really provide much, and Matthew Nyes, the final winger on this line, was practically invisible, I felt, in this particular game. And so I thought Celebrini, Graf, and Smith were playing very well, or at least quite well, to begin this one, and so I don't understand why they were swapped off. But the other reason, another reason to toss in here, is that the player who gets promoted up to this first line also doesn't make any sense. Kurashev is not some, unknown player who is now getting this first chance with Celebrini and Smith. We've seen them together multiple times already this season. Back at the beginning of the year, it remained that way for a few games. Then there was a sort of middle part there around game 15, game 20, where we also saw that trio put together. And while it hasn't been terrible necessarily, it also hasn't been particularly good either. And so I'm not sure why Warsofsky decides to go with Kurashev onto this top group. And the thing is, it's not even as though Kurashev has been playing extremely well as of late, or that he was really rolling here tonight. Like, he has been okay. And so this promotion it doesn't really seem to make much sense. I think Colin Graf is much better served on this top line. We finally got not only some actual good high danger opportunities for that top trio, but actual decent zone time as well. And it felt as though Graf was a big part of that. And putting Kurashev back onto that top line just seems like it would be a step backwards. Now, obviously, nothing is set in stone. Maybe this was just something that Warsofsky felt as though was necessary for the final half of this game. And you could argue it worked. I wouldn't say so, because the goal that was scored by Dmitry Orlov is a defenseman goal off of like an incredible individual effort because of that shot. And then the Klingberg goal is in a 6-on-5, so it doesn't really involve the lines in any which way. So it didn't really work, but perhaps Warsofsky will read it as such and put those players in that position for the next game. I certainly hope that doesn't happen, because to me, Graf, Celebrini, and Smith is the best that this first line has looked all year long, and I want to see more of it. When it comes to their individual games, Macklin Celebrini, I thought very similar to the one the other night against the Philadelphia Flyers, was able to create a lot of very good offensive chances. Probably could have had at least an extra point or two, but he will have to settle for just that one primary assist on the John Klingberg goal. But it was a solid night for him. When it comes to Colin Graf, he continued to just do Colin Graf things, get to the net, stick on the ice, be ready for some opportunities, be ready for some rebounds or some quick passes from his two very skilled line mates. And indeed, he had a couple of extremely close calls back at the beginning of this game. Now, once he got dropped down to the second line with Wenberg and Toffoli, his game didn't slack at all. I mean, he is still Colin Graf. He's still going to do exactly what he does because he sticks to his game very, very well. And so he did not look out of place in that spot, but I would still like to see him on the top line. And when it comes to Will Smith, a couple of really skilled plays as per usual, always kind of manages to blow your mind a little bit in each game, or almost every single game. There was a moment in the first period where he showcased tremendous patience before passing the puck to Celebrini for a very dangerous one-timer opportunity. So I liked Smith's performance. I liked this whole first line's performance. So again, surprised that it got separated. When it comes to the Sharks' second line, here we have Wenberg, Toffoli, and Eklund, though as I mentioned, at about the halfway mark, Eklund drops to the third, and it is Graf who takes his place. When it comes to Tyler Toffoli, I've obviously been incredibly critical of him throughout much of this season thus far. He hasn't really done much. Not only is he not really scoring any goals, but he's also not even generating many chances. So I will give him credit here tonight for actually seeing some level of improvement. The bar is rather low. Last year, I would say, oh, this guy hasn't scored in a few games. Now it's basically like, can he get a couple of looks on net, which he did manage to pull off here tonight. In the first period in particular, he probably had 3 or 4 pretty decent chances. And while he did slow down a little bit in the final 40 minutes, only maybe got 1 or 2 other opportunities, it was still an okay night. And again, the bar is pretty low for Tyler Toffoli. I'll take an okay night. Maybe he can build off of it. When it comes to Alex Wennberg, this actually ended up being a 3-point night for the Sharks' second line center. Now, 2 of these points, secondary assists on both the Orlov and Klingberg goal, not hugely impactful necessarily, but I will give him some credit for actually being the screen in front of the Leafs goaltender on that Klingberg goal that ends up tying the game up at 2. So while that secondary assist wasn't hugely impactful, his screen in front did manage to get the job done. And of course, the game winner, you have to give him credit for that as well. He continues to be extremely trusted by the coaching staff. I believe he actually had the highest time on ice of any forward on the Sharks team for this game. And so Warsofsky will always defer to him in so many of these tough situations. So while he still doesn't remain a second line center, I'm not changing my mind on that type of situation. He does what he can do his best in some of these situations, and he has been relatively solid throughout this entire year, at least dating back, I would say, past the first few games of the season where he had a pretty slow start. When it comes to William Eklund, Eklund hasn't been the greatest over these last few weeks, at least from an offensive perspective. He has remained pretty strong from a defensive perspective, like he continues to be part of a shutdown line for the San Jose Sharks that manages to at the very least do its job there, but this is still a player who needs to take on a certain load offensively, and he hasn't quite managed to pull that off. And so I really wasn't that upset to see him get dropped down to the third line, and that seemed to bring a little extra spark into his game. He had a couple of decent shifts there near the end, plus he ends up picking up the primary assist on the Alex Wennberg overtime game winner. But it was quite notable when the Sharks decided to not start William Eklund in that overtime and instead go with a setup of Wennberg Celebrini up front. That seems to be a message sent towards William Eklund that he does need to improve, and maybe that assist that he gets on the eventual game winner will be that. We'll see what happens with his lineup spot moving forward. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, we have Skinner, Dellandrea, and Kurashev. As I said, with Kurashev, I didn't necessarily think he was playing that well early on in this game. He was, again, okay for probably like a third or fourth straight night, but nothing spectacular, and so he gets promoted up to that top line for seemingly no reason. He did have a couple of good shifts there near the end of that game with those 2 players, and so it didn't go poorly or anything like that, but it's not as though it was blowing me away either. When it comes to Ty Dellandrea, he had a very strong start to this game, and in fact even managed to get his first career penalty shot and his first career penalty shot miss, as he was not able to beat the Leafs goaltender there. Perhaps not that much of a surprise. We have seen Dellandrea get some really good opportunities in each of these last couple of games and just fail to actually convert on each and every one of them, and you could say that then that continued here tonight. So maybe eventually the dam will break for Ty Dellandrea, but the difference between him and a guy like, Will Smith when he was on a goal schneid, or Tyler Toffoli even when he was on a goal schneid, is that those are players who have a very good shot that you expect to eventually turn it around. Dellandrea, not quite in the same boat, but still the fact that he's been able to contribute here or there, or at least get some chances here or there, I should say, is still relatively positive. And then when it comes to Jeff Skinner, a very similar game to what Jeff Skinner usually pulls up. You could probably think of like 1 or 2 moments where he actually had a decent chance on net, but I wouldn't say he was hugely impactful here tonight. When it comes to the Sharks' fourth line, obviously they had that extremely close call goal that ends up getting called back on the offside, but I do want to start off with Ryan Reeves because this was a bit of a revenge game for him. He was with the Toronto Maple Leafs this past season, and he played a handful of games for them, I believe close to 40 games, but post-trade deadline he actually got put onto waivers, if I'm not mistaken, and he did not play another game for the Leafs after that. He did not play a single playoff game for them either, and so it was a situation where they didn't necessarily leave on good terms together. And then, of course, he got traded in the offseason for Henry Thrun, who did play, by the way, in this game, his first game as a Toronto Maple Leafs. You could tell that the Leafs were aiming for him to be able to get that kind of revenge goal like we saw from Carl Grundstrom against the Philadelphia Flyers, but it did not work out here tonight. Ryan Reaves returning in this matchup. I would say that the Leafs were pretty justified, honestly, in having Reaves sit on the bench there. It's not as though that this was like a key player for them, I imagine, but it obviously was a moment where he was trying to try to prove that they made an incorrect choice, basically. And I do think Reaves came in with a good amount of energy here tonight. The bar is relatively low for Ryan Reaves, but this was probably one of his better games of the entire season. He had a couple of really good shifts there in the first period. He had one shift in the second period where I thought he picked off like 2 or 3 passes in the offensive zone. It didn't amount to much, but it showcased that he was really on the ball here tonight. They did have a couple of rougher shifts in the defensive zone as well, so it was certainly far from a perfect game for Ryan Reaves and his fourth line, but it was better than what we have usually been seeing from him, which was nice. When it comes to his 2 line mates, the thing here that bothers me a little bit is Gaudette on this fourth line. Now, he does end up replacing Ostapchuk, who comes out of the lineup in favor of getting Jeff Skinner back in there, and I have zero problems with that. Outside of the first couple of games when Ostapchuk was originally inserted into the lineup and he brought some extra level of speed and that motivation there, it feels as though he's kind of been practically invisible in many of these games, and when you do notice him, it's when he's making a huge mistake like he did the other night against the Philadelphia Flyers. But the reason I don't really like Gaudette in this spot is that I feel as though there's more potential here. We have seen him actually have some really good efforts when playing up into the top 9, and I don't think playing with Barclay Goodrow and Ryan Reaves is really going to be able to help foster that type of play, and so it's a little bit disappointing to see, but at the same time, the Sharks, maybe they just feel as though they don't really have the space in their top 9, and while Ty Dellandrea is certainly not a third-line center, he's been getting some chances, and I can understand why Warsofsky would stick with him in that spot, so I guess this is just how it needs to be. When it comes to the Sharks defensively, the big change is that they did swap out Nick Leddy in favor of Shakir Mukhamadullin, who had missed the previous 4 games. I'll get to that a little bit later, but obviously an exciting bit of substitution there in the lineup. But let us start off instead with the top pairing of Orlov and Klingberg. I was obviously a little bit worried seeing the lineup here coming into this one. I feel as though Klingberg should be a guy who is getting less ice time, but finding himself on the top pairing likely was going to be an indication that he would be getting more. But credit where credit is due to John Klingberg, despite him having played many bad games this season. I'm sure every San Jose Sharks fan has acknowledged that. I'm sure Ryan Warsofsky would acknowledge that. I'm sure John Klingberg himself would acknowledge that. You do still have to point out when the good games do come along, and tonight it was a good game. He picks up the game-tying goal. He has the primary assist on the Dmitry Orlov one, so now his point streak is at 3 games, 5 points over the last 3. It's important to mention this isn't some sort of crazy, consistent comeback from John Klingberg, because while he has put up points in each of the last 3 games, it's not as though he was actually any good. The other night against the Philadelphia Flyers, he was actually one of their worst defensemen, so this isn't 3 straight games of incredible play from John Klingberg, but he was very good against Carolina. He was, again, very solid here tonight against the Toronto Maple Leafs, and so you do have to give credit for when he is able to show up and play well, and hopefully scouts decided to sit out the first 2 months of the season for the San Jose Sharks and had only actually attended on this 5-game road trip, and they're looking at John Klingberg and saying like, hey, he must still have it, and the Sharks will be able to swindle a team into taking them off their hands when his no-trade clause does run out, or at least expand slightly at the end of the month of January. When it comes to his lineup partner, we have Dmitry Orlov, who, as I said, scores his first goal of the season, and it was a very impressive one. This is an absolutely incredible shot against a goaltender, Hildeby, who has been playing not only extremely well for the Toronto Maple Leafs, but has a ton of size as well. 6'7", he covers a lot of the net, and so there's not a huge amount of space there up high, even when he's down on his knees, and yet Orlov is able to pick it off and find it. He gets that goal, and this seemed to create a good bit of offensive confidence for Orlov. In fact, if you actually look at the Barclay Goodrow goal that would end up getting called off, it was Orlov with the original big stretch pass to Adam Gaudette there, which was a very impressive pass for sure. And so Orlov, I really liked his performance here tonight. Now, I will say there were a couple of moments in this game that this defensive pairing did get caught on the ice making a mistake below the goal line. This actually led twice to some insanely good chances for the Toronto Maple Leafs in front, and fortunately, Nedeljkovic was able to come up with the save both times. If he maybe let in even one of those goals, if not both of those goals, probably wouldn't be as positive about this top group, especially since it probably would have led to a San Jose Sharks loss. But because those do end up getting saved, you can mostly focus on the positives. When it comes to the Sharks' second defensive pairing, here we have Ferraro and Shakir Mukhamadullin. So as I said, Mukhamadullin had not played the previous 4 games due to being a healthy scratch. He returns here tonight, and this was actually one of his best, if not his best games of the entire season. Now, he didn't do a ton from an offensive perspective, but I thought he was incredibly solid defensively. He was positionally very sound. He was challenging players. He was killing plays. He was really just very, very solid within his own end. And so one might be willing to give credit to Ryan Warsofsky for having given him this reset of missing those 4 games and allowing him to get into the proper headspace. But at the same time, Warsofsky, this was kind of a problem of his own creation. Like, if you lend your car to a friend and they crash it into a pole and then pay for the repairs, you don't congratulate them for paying for the repairs because they were the one who broke the car in the first place. Mukhamadullin came into this season, he was playing decently well prior to his injury and then got inexplicably healthy scratched, and then after his injury and then got inexplicably healthy scratched again. And that's really where the confidence ended up getting worn down. Mukhamadullin has said that himself in a recent interview that he did, that his confidence, he thought he was playing well and then suddenly he gets in and out of the lineup, healthy scratch here or there, and that caused him to get worse and worse. And so you could say, well, Warsofsky knew exactly what he was doing by having him sit out 4 straight games and resetting so that he would come in tonight and play very well against the Toronto Maple Leafs, but this wasn't a situation that we should have been in the first place. However, still, good night for Shakir. When it comes to his defensive partner, Mario Ferraro, he also takes a step forward. I would like to mention that the Ferraro-Mukhamadullin pairing historically this season and even dating back to the end of last year has been very solid, and that continued here tonight. Ferraro, I had mentioned that we wanted to see more from him because while his last few games weren't bad, it certainly wasn't the level that he had been playing at through the month of November, but he shows up here tonight and plays very well in this game. And then when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, here we have Sam Dickinson and Timothy Liljegren. And let us start off with Dickinson. So I mentioned when it comes to Ryan Reeves that he had a bit of a revenge game for this one because he had previously been with the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now for Sam Dickinson, it is not a revenge game type of situation, but a homecoming game. He is from the area. This is his first time playing in Toronto. He had a bunch of friends and family in the audience for this one. And so a motivation to actually be able to play rather well, but it is a thin line to walk because you could want to bring your best foot forward and put your A game into this one and end up having one of your best games of the entire season, but you could also end up crossing that line and simply trying to do too much. It is a difficult line to cross or to walk for sure. If you go back to last season, for instance, Will Smith in his homecoming game against the Boston Bruins, that was the game that really turned around his entire season. He played fantastic against the Bruins in Boston and then was great to end off that entire year. Here tonight, Dickinson, it felt as though the pressure simply got to him. He was not very good at all throughout much of this game. There were a couple of times in that first period where he got victimized by William Nylander, which isn't anything crazy because Nylander is one of the most skilled players, just like in terms of puck handling skills in the entire NHL. So that didn't necessarily stand out as like a huge mistake, but the thing was that it didn't really improve from there. And it felt as though a lot of the time into the second period and even into the third period, there were just some very simple mistakes being made by Sam Dickinson, some poor choices with the puck in his own zone, not huge disasters or anything like that, not major mistakes like we had been seeing from Shakir Mukhamadullin prior to these last 4 healthy scratch games, but it was just not really all that secure of a game. And so Sam Dickinson, whose ice time had been recently climbing up a decent bit over these last couple of games that he had played, getting into those 17 or so minutes, it does take a step back here tonight, and deservingly so, I would say. Now, do I think Sam Dickinson should lose his spot in the lineup moving into the next game? Absolutely not. He should be right back in there to play against the Pittsburgh Penguins, but it does need to be noted that this was not a good night for him. And when it comes to his defensive partner, Timothy Liljegren, I don't think Liljegren was great, but I will say he was kind of dragged down by some of the poor mistakes that Sam Dickinson was making. Now, this was also a bit of a revenge game, you could say, for Liljegren because he is a former Toronto Maple Leafs, but it does feel as though he kind of had most of his revenge last year. If you recall, in the previous year, Liljegren's 2 best games of the entire year with the Sharks were the 2 games that the Sharks actually played against Toronto, so he very clearly had a chip on his shoulder, but it seems as though that has kind of run out heading into tonight. It is now water under the bridge for him, and so in this game, I don't think he necessarily played horribly, but he didn't play all that well either. And then when it comes to the Sharks goaltender, it is Nedeljkovic again. So Askarov was healthy enough to actually back up Nedeljkovic for this particular game, unlike was the case in the last one against the Philadelphia Flyers, but not quite healthy enough to actually insert and have start the game here tonight. So Nedeljkovic plays again and does rather well. He made a few really important saves there back in the first period. The Dakota Joshua one was an unfortunate deflection, if I am not mistaken, because I think it goes off of Liljegren at some point in front. And then the Matthews goal was just a cross-ice pass, Nylander to Matthews. Very, very difficult save to make here on the power play, but he was able to come up with some big moments in other parts of this game that helped keep the San Jose Sharks alive, helped keep them only down a couple of goals, and he ends up just coming through for the team, so he played rather well. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, where they'll be taking on the Pittsburgh Penguins, the final game of this 5-game road trip. The Sharks have played the Penguins before this season. This was actually the final loss of their season opening 6-game losing streak. It might have been their 5th loss, and the final loss was against the Islanders. So yeah, their 5th loss of the season, but it was their first shutout loss of the entire year, 3-0 to the Penguins. The Sharks didn't actually play all that poorly in that game, but they'll be looking for a little bit of revenge anyway. Class dismissed.